Hi everyone, my name is Dana Freshley and I'm a PhD student working on Work Package 4. And welcome to my presentation entitled Results of the Beekeeper Intake Survey, Insights into Beekeeper Managerial Characteristics. So I'll start with an introduction and then I'll give an overview of methods. Then I have some exploratory results and I have some takeaways and lessons learned from the survey, and finally, the future work that we have planned. So, hive management practices are increasingly seen as a preventative tool to control factors that negatively affect honeybee health. So, recommendations currently exist for healthy and sustainable hive management that include best practices for European beekeepers. So, these already exist. However, there's enormous heterogeneity between beekeeper management styles in Europe. So around 1/3 of beekeepers in Europe are professionals and 2/3 are hobbyists. And these hobbyists have varying motivations to keep bees, whether it be for honey production, pollination services, enjoyment, or out of concern for honeybee decline. So in Europe, beekeepers do things in many, many different ways. So the end goal is to develop tailored recommendations for healthy and sustainable beekeeping management practices for different types of beekeepers within Europe. So the purpose of this exploratory phase is to explore beekeeper variability and to detect patterns in beekeeper management styles. And this is a precursor to a larger study that we have planned involving 600 beekeepers throughout Europe. So the future survey involving 600 beekeepers, the goal of that survey is to categorize beekeepers based on management styles, which can then be approached differently with different advice and guidelines. So to explore the variability in beekeeper management styles, data was gathered from 40 selected beekeepers enrolled in Tier 2 of the Be Good project. And the following information was collected from these 40 beekeepers via an online survey. So we collected data on beekeepers' personal characteristics, their beekeeping characteristics, so their production factors, inputs and outputs, their management objectives, and finally, their surrounding environmental characteristics. So there was emphasis on beekeepers' differences in input use, especially between hobby and professional beekeepers. So the difference that arise in opportunity costs can play a role in developing good beekeeping practices for different types of beekeepers. So we use data envelopment analysis, DEA, as an exploratory tool to understand beekeeper heterogeneity. So DEA is a non-parametric technique to measure the technical efficiency of decision-making units. And DEA assumes homogeneity among DMUs, beekeepers, in terms of their nature and the operations, the nature of their operations and the conditions in which they operate. And DEA assumes homogeneity, but in fact, in this study, we use it to explore the heterogeneity and explore the differences in input use between beekeepers. So moving on to the measurement features. So we have several measurement features that we use to explore the beekeepers. So there's two main measures, efficiency and productivity, that we use to explore. So efficiency scores for each beekeeper were calculated using the program DEEP, using an input-oriented DEA model. So we used one input, or one output, honey, and two inputs, the number of colonies and the number of man days for labor. And for productivity, the productivity values for each beekeeper were calculated using kilograms of honey per hive. So these are our two main measurement features. It's important to mention that being an efficient or productive beekeeper does not necessarily correlate with bee health, nor is it the goal of all beekeepers. However, these two measures are more used as a tool to further understand the variability between beekeepers, keeping in mind that efficiency and productivity is just one piece of the equation. So moving on to the other measurement features that we used in the survey. So these are the other variables that we gathered in the survey used to explore the differences between beekeepers. So these are variables hypothesized to contribute to efficiency and/or productivity. So we have personal characteristics, management characteristics, their production characteristics, and environmental characteristics. So moving on to the results. So our sample composition of these 40 beekeepers enrolled in Tier 2, 8 were professional and 32 were hobbyists. The number of hives ranged from 3 to 600. The ages ranged from 18 to 69 years, with a mean age of 49 years. They've been active with beekeeping for a minimum of 2, maximum 46 years. 32 were male, 8 were female, and personal interest was their stronger driver to start with beekeeping. Productivity was highest in Germany, and efficiency scores were highest in Finland. However, there were both more and less efficient beekeepers in each region. All beekeepers produced honey as their main output. 27 beekeepers also produced wax. 10 beekeepers also engaged in pollination services, and less than 7 beekeepers also produced propolis colonies or queens. And honey was the most economically relevant output, followed by pollination services. So here shows the number of colonies between professional and hobby. So professionals had significantly more colonies. So the average number of colonies for all beekeepers was 63, for professional was 225, and for hobby it was only 18. And these three graphs, the scales are not the same on all three graphs, but it's easier to see the box plots because for professionals have a significant higher number of colonies. Here shows the overview of productivity between professional and hobby. So productivity differed only slightly between professional and hobby. Professionals were only slightly more productive. So professionals had an average productivity of 23 kilograms per hive, and for hobbyists, it was 21 kilograms per hive. Here shows the efficiency scores between professional and hobbyists. So efficiency scores range from 0 to 1. So in general, there's quite low efficiency scores among the beekeepers. Professionals were slightly more efficient. So professionals had an average efficiency of 0.489, and hobbyists had an average efficiency of 0.384. Here shows their environmental scores between professional and hobby. So for the environmental scores, the scores were calculated for each beekeeper using the sum of Likert agreement scores for 6 environmental indicators. So we have the 6 environmental indicators that we gathered in the survey were concerning floral resources, chemical contaminants, climate change, environmental policy, and collaboration with farmers. So the negative for the negative environmental indicators, such as chemical contaminants, these scores were reversed, and then the sum was taken to get the environmental score. So the maximum that the beekeepers can have is 30. So hobbyists had slightly higher environmental scores. So here shows an isoquant map. So now we're starting to get into the DEA analysis. So this isoquant map shows all of the combinations of 2 inputs, labor, man days, and the number of colonies that result in the same amount of honey output. So this graph shows the relationship between the number of colonies and labor, so manpower. So each point on this graph represents an individual DMU that shows their specific combination of labor and colonies to produce the same amount of honey. So this graph shows there's essentially two two different types of efficient beekeepers. There's two different types of efficiency. Those that have a small number of hives with a lot of labor, and those with a large number of hives with a low labor use. So we use this graph to explore the differences between these two groups and what is driving efficiency, what is behind efficiency, and what makes beekeepers have an efficient use of labor and number of colonies. So the hobby beekeepers are in blue and the professional beekeepers are in yellow. So here we are exploring beekeepers with a high labor use. So these are beekeepers situated along the labor axis, which means they have a high labor use. So in exploring these beekeepers that are circled by these orange circles here, these beekeepers had a slightly higher intent to use hive monitoring technology. They had a lower annual investment and they were higher educated. So now we move to the other side of the graph, and this shows beekeepers with less of a labor use. So therefore, these beekeepers have a more effective use of labor. And we found that they were more efficient, they had more colonies, they had more output types, they were less experienced, they had a higher annual investment in their beekeeping practice, and they had higher environmental scores. So next, we are comparing the 6 hobbyists that were more efficient than professionals. So these circles here in blue that you see, these indicate the 6 most efficient hobbyists. So these are hobbyists who were more efficient than the professionals. So we found that these 6 efficient hobbyists, they were younger, they were less educated, they had a lower intent to use hive monitoring technology, they were more productive, they had more colonies, and they had a higher annual investment and higher environmental scores. So here we show the beekeepers that engaged in pollination services. So the ones circled here in orange are beekeepers that engaged in pollination services. Like I said before, pollination services was the second most economically relevant output behind honey. So this just shows that pollination services were practiced by many different types of beekeepers, so both hobby and professional beekeepers. And this might indicate that pollination services might be a viable option for income diversification besides just focusing on honey. So overall, efficiency scores were higher among beekeepers with more years of experience, beekeepers with a range of output types, honey, propolis, wax, etc., and beekeepers with a higher annual investment. And then concerning the environmental indicators, efficiency scores were higher among beekeepers who indicated having sufficient floral resources all bee season, and those who indicated that they work with farmers to encourage biodiversity. So it's important to mention the limitation of this study. So it's important to mention that this analysis is based on a very small amount of beekeeper data. So this is only the 40 beekeepers enrolled in Tier 2. Our sample selection is a bit biased because the 40 beekeepers were hand-selected by Be Good partners, which might be that the beekeepers are a bit more engaged or highly educated. And then, of course, not all beekeepers filled out the economic questions completely. So for the DEA analysis, we excluded 7 outliers due to either incorrectly filled or unclear filled variables in the economic section. So the takeaways and lessons learned. So from this analysis of the 40 beekeepers enrolled in Tier 2, we learned that beekeepers exhibit huge variability in beekeeper type, age, years of experience, education levels, and input use. We learned that professional beekeepers had a significantly higher number of colonies and they were slightly more productive than hobbyists. And hobbyists had slightly higher environmental scores, But what we also learned is that efficiency scores were well distributed among all countries and also among both professional and hobby beekeepers. So we learned that both hobby and professional beekeepers can be efficient. More takeaways and lessons learned. Beekeepers with a high labor use had a slightly higher intent to use hive monitoring technology. So the fact that beekeepers with a high labor use had higher intent to use hive monitoring technology may be promising because it suggests that the market for the Beep app, for example, may be beekeepers interested in replacing some of those labor hours with technological monitoring. The second point, beekeepers with less labor use, indicating a more effective use of labor, were more efficient overall and had more colonies. And the most efficient beekeepers among the hobbyists, so the most efficient hobbyists, they were younger and they had a higher annual investment. So the fact that most efficient hobbyists were younger might indicate that there is promise for the younger generation of beekeepers to be just as efficient as those as older beekeepers. And finally, the years of experience might play a role in efficiency. So the years of experience is very important to pay attention to because it shows that the passing down of knowledge is, as we know, the passing down of knowledge is very important in the practice of beekeeping. So we want to gain more insight into the years of experience. And this will be we'll gather more information on this in the future survey with 600 beekeepers. So now some takeaways and lessons learned about the more logistical part of the survey, lessons learned for the future 600 beekeeper survey. So the motivations to practice beekeeping should not only be classified as personal, family, financial, as we did in the current survey, but it should also include their motivations for production goals, like do they engage in beekeeping for profit, for nonprofit, what are their main production activities, etc. We should also gather and analyze beekeepers' attitudes towards hive monitoring technology to gain more depth into their actual attitudes and not just their usage of hive monitoring technology. We also need a better non-subjective indication of the surrounding environment. So in this study, we had a subjective indication of the surrounding environment and we had beekeepers select what they thought the quality of their surrounding environment was, but we need to have a better indication of this in the 600 survey. And finally, working with farmers to encourage biodiversity should be further explored. So this is a really interesting point that more efficient beekeepers indicated that they indeed do work with farmers. So this should be further explored as well. So the 600 beekeeper survey that we have planned coming up in September, the key objective of this survey is to identify typologies of beekeepers across the EU, which then can be approached differently with advice and guidelines, like I said in the introduction. So these typologies will mainly be based on their drivers and motives to engage with beekeeping, and also the typologies will be based on patterns in their beekeeping management styles. So the drivers and motives to engage with beekeeping, this is really important because some beekeepers engage with beekeeping for commercial purposes, so either honey production or pollination, services for profit, and then there's beekeepers that engage in beekeeping for personal reasons, like honey production, pollination, enjoyment, or out of concern for the environment. So this is really important to take into consideration. The beekeeper typologies will be based on the following criteria: socio-demographic data, motivations to practice beekeeping, like I just said, the economic performance, general management practices, honeybee health, the use and attitude towards hive monitoring technology, and the quality of the surrounding environment. So we will identify from these criteria the information needs related to healthy and sustainable beekeeping. So in a larger survey involving 600 beekeepers, much more data will be used to understand the beekeeping management styles. And in some groups where the commercial interest is clearly predominant, we can still assess their economic performance using a DEA model. So like I said before, their motives are different, especially between professional and hobby beekeepers. So in the groups where the beekeepers are practicing beekeeping for commercial purposes, we can then use the DEA model, and ideally also including the environmental variables directly into the DEA model. This is it for my presentation. Thank you so much for your attention, and we welcome your questions.